Leading up to ANZAC Day, I wanted to react to some videos on the ANZACs, specifically about Gallipoli. This is Sabaton History's Cliffs of Gallipoli Part 1, The Great War. Let's get to it.
I'm neidell.
And I'm Joakim from Sabaton.
And this is Sabaton History. Now, this song is going to be covered in 2 episodes, so I can cover 2 aspects of the topic. Gallipoli. For 8 months in 1915, that name was headline news worldwide.
And our song, Cliffs of Gallipoli, is a tribute to the men who fought and died there.
I will react to episode 2 as well as the song, and I will put that at the end once I actually publish them.
The Great War was just a half-year old, but casualties had already risen to unthinkable levels. British soldiers were dying by the tens of thousands in the bloody stalemate on the Western Front. Leading politicians began looking for an alternative to the slaughter in the trenches. Most vocal among them were Lord Kitchener, Secretary of State for War, and Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, who thought that instead of trying to beat the Germans in Flanders, they should strike towards the weakest link of the Central Powers, the Ottoman Empire. They believed the Ottoman military to be second-rate, more of a nuisance than an equal. Churchill envisioned a strike against Constantinople itself by sea. Taking the Turkish capital would drive the Ottomans out of the war and open up a direct shipping route towards Britain's Russian ally.
A swift victory would also encourage or inspire some of the neutral countries, such as Greece, to actually join the war with the Allies. I believe Greece actually waited until 1917 to officially join the war.
Indirectly, it would safeguard British interests in Mesopotamia and Suez as well. So on paper, this seemed like a total win-win for the Allies. A major reason for the British hubris was the recent military record of the Ottoman Empire. Serious defeats during the Balkan Wars and the recent catastrophic outcome of the Battle of Sarikamish just weeks ago, where tens of thousands of soldiers froze to death in the Caucasus Mountains, painted a picture of incompetent leaders and a badly equipped and trained Ottoman military. The sick man at the Bosporus would be no match for the professional British soldiers. There was, however, a major obstacle along the way. To strike against Constantinople, any Allied fleet would have to penetrate the Straits of the Dardanelles that guard the entrance to the Sea of Marmara. And those straits were narrow and had been a natural line of defense for centuries. And the sick man was not as sick as the British believed. Since the Balkan Wars, the defenses of the straits had been continually improved and ammunition restocked. In addition to long-range guns, the Ottomans had mobile 120mm howitzer batteries on the ready, highly trained troops, and line after line of mines in the waters. Under Çanakkale Fortified Area Command of General Fahri Pasha, the Dardanelles became the most fortified area of the whole Ottoman Empire.
And Great Britain knew about this. 1906 to 1907, Great Britain's Committee of Imperial Defense actually conducted a study which concluded that any kind of mission to capture this area would be too dangerous and not feasible. Yet somehow, less than 10 years later, that warning was actually completely ignored or forgotten when they were actually planning for this campaign.
The British and French fleets tried to force passage through the straits. Even a modern warship can be sunk by a single mine, though. And after disaster on March 18, 1915, when the Ottomans sank 3 Allied battleships and severely damaged 3 more, the Allies had to rethink.
Great Britain was a naval power at the time, but most of their fleet was actually fighting the Germans on the Western Front. So all the outdated ships were actually here for the Gallipoli campaign.
The artillery positions on the hills had to be taken out first by land if the operation towards Constantinople was to succeed. The task was given to General Sir Ian Hamilton, in overall command of the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force. The MEF included, along with British units, the ANZAC, Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, under General Sir William Birdwood. ANZAC had been heading for Britain before being diverted to Egypt. Instead of fighting Germans, they would now fight the Ottomans. The Australians, New Zealanders, and Maoris of ANZAC considered themselves natural soldiers. men hardened by daily outdoor activity, and the aggressive and unruly character of the ANZACs seemed perfect for the task ahead. The MEF was further strengthened by an Indian brigade and the Gurkha Rifles, who joined the ANZACs and a French force at Malta in early March.
For those of you who don't know, the Maoris are the native New Zealanders, the ones that do those terrifying war cries and chants and make those faces. And the Gurkhas are specially recruited Nepalese soldiers for Great Britain and India that are some of the most ferocious fighters on the planet. Stories about them are actually legendary. But let's also not forget that the French Foreign Legion also had a battalion here, as well as the Irish and Newfoundland as well.
The French government was not too keen on the whole endeavor, but they themselves had their own ambitions in the Middle East and could not simply leave it all to the British if they succeeded in toppling the Ottomans. The French created the 1st Division Corps Expeditionnaire d'Orient, made up of regular French troops, the French Foreign Legion, and Senegalese and Zouave forces. Once again, though, the planning phase betrayed the arrogance of British high command. While generals on the western or eastern fronts made plans for all sorts of eventualities and for a quick exit if everything suddenly went to hell, nothing of the sort was prepared for the Gallipoli landings. Instead, Hamilton's plan was overambitious, and it had one critical flaw. It all depended on the Ottoman inability to stand up to the invaders. But what if they did not turn and run and instead stood and fought? German influence over the Ottoman forces was personified by General Otto Liman von Sanders in command of the 5th Army at Gallipoli. Ever since the naval attacks, it was thought that an invasion might take place, and the British did little to hide their intentions. In fact, the Greek newspapers ran headlines about the coming landings. But the Gallipoli Peninsula was large, and the Ottoman forces could not guard every beach. Von Sanders decided to put only a screening force as a tripwire defense close to the beaches and keep most of his men in reserve units further back. Ottoman officers at the front would assess the situation and send in reinforcements where necessary. One such officer was Lieutenant Colonel Mustafa Kemal, in command of the Ottoman 19th Division. He was familiar with the defenses, and his troops were well-trained, motivated, and equipped. In fact, with the help of German instructors and weapon supplies, it was quite a formidable fighting force. The landings began the night of April 25th. The ANZACs would land on the west of the peninsula at a place called Gaba Tepe, later known as ANZAC Cove.
Apparently, the ANZACs actually landed about 1 mile further north than they should have landed. Currents and bad map reading have been blamed for why the ANZACs landed in the wrong place. The original landing area was actually supposed to be a flat area, whereas ANZAC Cove had cliffs that were easily defended. Another theory on why the ANZACs landed in the wrong position was that the night before, some Ottoman soldiers had noticed some buoys just off the coast of their intended landing zone, and they actually ended up moving the buoys further up to ANZAC Cove.
They would build a bridgehead and advance the next day all the way to the heights of Maltepe. The other British troops would land at the tip of the peninsula, Cape Helles, and then take Achibaba and the Kilid Bar Plateau in one fell swoop. After that, they would simply join forces and push the Ottomans from the heights. There were also several diversionary landings around the flanks, with the French landing on the Asian side of the straits at Comcale. Illuminated by the moon, the ANZAC landing craft made their way towards their destination, fighting the strong currents. The beaches were in darkness and all was still, and hopes were high that they would fully surprise the enemy. But as soon as they made ground, the first bullets crashed into the boats. A concert of rapid rifle fire erupted, and the battle for Gallipoli had begun. ANZAC was not even facing an entire battalion, but the sudden fire caused confusion as the first casualties began to litter the beaches. As more and more ANZACs landed, the outnumbered Ottomans retreated to higher ground and into prepared trenches. And as the sun rose, they fired freely into the mass of men on the beaches. The ANZACs had been ordered not to load their rifles and instead rushed up the hill, bayonets fixed. But in the dim morning, It was hard to navigate the steep heights and the thorny undergrowth, and the Ottomans fired and retreated further.
And to give you an idea of just how bad the landings at ANZAC Cove was, imagine it is Omaha Beach in Normandy on D-Day. Only imagine it 100 times worse. Instead of the steep sloping hills that you see at Omaha Beach, you have rocky cliffs and high ridges.
The ANZACs were soon left out in the open, trying to make sense of the rough terrain, climbing the high ridges, running through razor-sharp thorns and over slippery stones, soon left the men exhausted, and many fell to accurate Ottoman sniper fire. The maps were totally inadequate, and the officers still standing were overwhelmed by the situation. The Ottomans themselves retreated towards the heights of Chunuk Bair. From the high ground, they could direct artillery fire onto the beaches. Mustafa Kemal was among the first to understand that the landings at ANZAC Cove were not a diversion, but were the real deal. He ordered his division to Sari Bair, the highest point on the peninsula. But while he himself was trying to get a better view of the situation, he saw exhausted men flooding back from the fighting. Upon ordering them to stop, they declared that the ANZACs were moving up and they themselves had no ammunition left. While Kemal's orderlies were running back to get the division moving, he ordered the men he'd halted to fix their bayonets and turn back to attack with the now famous words, "I don't order you to attack, I order you to die. In the time which passes until we die, other troops and commanders can take our place."
Oh, talk about savage words.
The pursuing ANZACs were totally caught off guard by the sudden counterattack. Fearing that Ottoman reserves had already arrived, they pulled back. Everywhere around ANZAC Cove, the Ottoman resistance began to stiffen. Attempts to cross the ridges were immediately met with heavy fire from an unseen enemy. The invaders were stuck. At Helles, the situation was even worse. Way worse. This was an obvious landing site, and the Ottoman defenders had prepared thoroughly. As the Allied landing craft closed in on the beaches, they were met with a deadly hail of bullets. Many men were hit before they could make landing. Others panicked and jumped into the water. Many of those drowned, dragged down by their heavy kit. But those that made it out of the boats met belts of barbed wire guarding the beach, trapping them in the open. Soon, bodies littered the beach, and the waves washed ashore blood red. Men lucky enough to make it through huddled down behind a sandbank. At just 5 feet high, around 1.5 meters, it was the only cover available. Again, there were only a few Ottoman platoons defending the area, but they had fortified trenches and knew how to use their rifles and field artillery to deadly effect. The British officers could only watch as the landing crafts were blown to pieces. The men at Helles were trapped. Similar scenes happened at the other landing places. Y Beach was shot to pieces, while the attacks on X and S broke down the same way as the main landings without major results.
Ever hear the expression 6 Victoria Crosses before breakfast? That was because on W Beach on the day of the landing, the Lancaster Fusiliers, a British unit, actually earned 6 Victoria Crosses for its actions that day, which says a lot considering that Great Britain gave a total of 12 Victoria Crosses for the entire campaign.
Often forgotten by the history books is the French landing at Kum Calais, the only semi-victory that day. That force, under General Albert d'Amada, was to silence the Ottoman guns on the Asian side of the straits and divert Ottoman troops. Their actual landing was nearly unopposed, but the overall Ottoman forces facing them were far more numerous than on the European side. Fighting for the tiny town lasted all day, but the vicious close-quarter combat was for naught. The invasion plan had failed. And as darkness fell, it came as a relief. For the exhausted Ottomans, it was time to fall back and reorganize and wait for the reserves. For the Allies, the cover of night was a saving grace. Finally, they could make a move. Men could come ashore, the injured could be tended to, and fresh officers could take charge. The wounded flooded back to the medical ships. But the doctors and nurses were not prepared for the amount of casualties. There was not enough room. There was not enough morphine. And even if a wounded man survived, it was still a journey of 600 miles, 1,000 kilometers, back to Alexandria to recuperate.
It was so bad on that ship that they actually had to amputate people's limbs without any anesthetic.
And so the first day of Gallipoli came to an end. But the campaign had only just begun.
I'm loving the song. So here's a question. Were the Allies able to bring any artillery or mortars or anything like that onto the beach on the first day? Or did that happen later on that night? Or this whole campaign was a giant shit show. How do you plan an operation of that scope in only 1 month, from fruition to execution? That makes no sense. Who had the final approval to even do this operation? Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. Once I film part 2 and the lyrical video, I'll put them right here, lest we forget.